start there. There we go. Hello everyone. Sunday morning. Much cooler than it was yesterday, which is nice. This is going to be my review of Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher and released by Zero Classics. Zero Classics seems like a very, very interesting publisher. I've never read anything by them before, but if you just go through some of their titles, they seem interesting. I'll read you a couple. Poor but Sexy, Culture Clashes in Europe, East and West. That's by Agata Pijek. An Anthology of Nothing in Particular by Martin Demand Fredrickson. In the Dust of This Planet, Horror of Philosophy, Volume 1 by Eugene Thacker. The End of Oulipo, An Attempt to Exhaust a Movement. Capitalist Realism is an alternative. This became one of their defining books, actually, one of their bestsellers. Rebel Rebel, Chris O'Leary, David Bowie, Every Single Song, Everything You Want to Know, Everything You Didn't Know. I know a few people who'd enjoy that. Cartographies of the Absolute, Malign Velocities, Babbling Corpse, Vaporware and the Commodification of Ghosts by Grafton Tanner. So it looks like there's a few books by Zero Classics, which I hadn't heard of, so if you haven't heard of them, maybe you'll find that a good recommendation. Romeo and Juliet in Palestine, Teaching Under Occupation by Tom Sperlinger. The Writing on the Wall, New York, New Work, New Culture, Digesting Recipes, The Art of Culinary Notation. I'm not sure if that one would be very interesting. This has got cobwebs on it, but I only read it a couple of weeks ago. So, I picked this one up, and the reason I picked it up was because on the back I read this. Capitalist Realism is the most important document the British left has produced so far this century by Novara Media. Ooh. But it's not just loony lefties giving it good reviews. The Best Guide to British Politics Today, that's by The Economist. So what's it about? Who was Mark Fisher? Mark Fisher, unfortunately, has committed suicide. So he was suffering from mental health problems. And when some people commit suicide, I remember this happened with me. Why did they do it? You get angry and everything. A friend of my best friend who committed suicide once met up with me, and he said to me, remember, he was sick. And he didn't kill himself, he died of an illness. But let's get back to the book anyway. Really good book, by the way. I'm going to give this one 10 out of 10. There's a lot to unpack in it. And the main idea of the book is that capitalist realism, it's hard to imagine an alternative to capitalism. And there's a few reasons for that. It's very pervasive in our society. Those reasons are very pervasive in our society. The first chapter actually is called It's Easier to Imagine the End of the World Than It Is to Imagine the End of Capitalism. And that gives you an idea. Capitalism could fail, and before, people have bought and sold things for millennia before capitalism. So it's not like if capitalism fails, oh, there's no business anymore. Capitalism is a political structure. Capitalism is an ideology as well, and obviously the current ideology that's dominant is neoliberalism, which also is not the only way to have capitalism, by the way. There was Fordism as well. Fordism is named after Henry Ford, where you had a strong welfare state, rising wages, what's the other tenet? So jobs for life kind of thing, steady jobs, mass production. So that's Fordism. And in here there's actually a chapter about what happened when Fordism ended. I think a good thing to do here would be just to go through the book chapter by chapter. So first of all, you've got an introduction actually by his wife, who obviously he's now dead, so that's quite touching and quite a good read. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. One of the things that Mark Fisher does, which is very good, is he uses culture to show how our beliefs are shaped, and also refers to culture in terms of films, songs, what we think and what we believe, which makes sense, right? And in It's Easier to Imagine the End of Capitalism Than the End of the World, he talks about even when you have dystopian films now, there's never really a solution in them. There's no way out. One of the things he does in this book, and it reminds me of the last book I reviewed, which was Fahrenheit 451 is that there is a way to fix things. In Fahrenheit 451, it's the people memorizing books and trying to pass them on, because Fahrenheit 451 is all about books aren't allowed, you have to burn them. Anyway, let's get to chapter 2. Right, so if I just go through the here we go. What if you held a protest and everyone came? That was very interesting, because that chapter is about how even when people speak out against capitalism now, even protests, even movements to try and bring about political change, they just get commodified. So they get turned into products, they get turned into online kind of memes, they get turned into, I mean, the fact that Primark now sells, or has for a long time, sold t-shirts by the kind of bands that were fringe bands, that if you listen to, everyone was, what the hell are you listening to? What is that noise? I mean, Primark sells Slayer t-shirts, for God's sake. So, as a rebellious kind of music, that's now become so mainstream that you've got kids walking around and people walking around wearing Slayer t-shirts. They've never heard a Slayer song in their life. It's being commodified. That might not be the best example, but it's one example. God, this is a very structured book review for me, isn't it? I usually ramble like hell. I don't know if you guys enjoyed this, but that's what if you held a protest and everyone came. Capitalism and the Real. That's chapter 3. That was really good. Just like in, you hear about communist countries, these terrible, evil communist countries where everything is controlled by the state and everything is censored and you're not allowed to speak out against the state. I mean, that's happening in Dubai right now. People who are taking photographs of the destruction in Dubai because it's contrary to the idea of Dubai as this kind of, and the Arab Emirates as this glittering, safe, kind of, neutral country where you can go and have a nice life. No, but they helped they helped Israel and America to bomb Iran and basically kill all the Palestinians. So now they're getting pummeled. It's only 100 rockets a day as opposed to the 1,000 rockets a day that Israel prepared for in war games. But they're still getting bombed. It's still not safe there. A lot of people who live there are coming to the UK now and filling up the private schools. They want someone to educate their kids. Anyway, that's going off on a tangent. But what was the chapter? See, I've started rambling again. I've lost it. Chapter 3 that was, wasn't it? Let's get back to the plot there. Capitalism and the Real. So the idea of capitalism and the real is that there's as much propaganda telling you that capitalism and what it does is good and everything's fine and everything's working as there was, or as there is, in communist states and kind of dictatorships. Except what it tells us that capitalism is freedom and democracy and everything is good, and there's no alternative, by the way. The phrase "there's no alternative," Tina, I also read about in a book. I think it was Thatcher who used it first. There is no alternative, Tina. I think that's what she was, basically killing off the unions and using the police to crush the miners. There is no alternative. That comes up in here as well. So that's a big part of capitalism, is there is no alternative, which kind of fits in with the title here, doesn't it? Reflexive immobilization and liberal communism. I can't actually remember what that chapter's about, but I might remember the don't let yourself get attached to anything. That's chapter 6. Chapter 5, October 6, 1979. That's the end of Fordism, which I talked about a couple of minutes ago. Don't let yourself get attached to anything, because there is no security anymore. There is no stability. Everybody's got to be an entrepreneur. This is the new capitalism. So these are main themes. There are some chapters which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, because I think if you can watch the overlap of one reality with another, capitalist realism as dream work and memory disorder. That's going back to the whole idea of, there's nothing wrong with capitalism, because if you think there is, then you just need to watch more propaganda. It's like the fact that Reform just got voted in some boroughs, didn't they? If any of the people who voted for Reform actually knew any of their policies, they'd probably be terrified. It's generally the people who voted to leave the EU, those places, older people who are not going to get their benefits if Reform comes in. They can kiss goodbye to the NHS if Reform comes in. They can kiss goodbye to all the people who care for them, because they tend to be foreign workers. But let's not get too political. One of my favourite parts of this book, I'll get to the end of it first. There's no central exchange. So with capitalism, everything's been basically, there's no central exchange, means there's no one person in charge. Who do you blame, the government or the companies that are really running the country? There's nobody to be held accountable. A really good example of this, of course, is the financial system. So capitalism, neoliberalism, could have collapsed. We would have found an alternative in 2008, but it wasn't allowed to collapse. They bailed out the banks. It was 3.5 trillion. And then they thought, oh shit, how can we make back that money? Nobody was held accountable. I think there was like one arrest in the UK. It might have even been in the States for the collapse of the financial system. One arrest. And anyway, the government bailed them out. So there's capitalism for you. It's socialism backwards. Capital controls the country, not society, not the government. It's not for society, it's for capital. That 3.5 trillion, and then they thought, okay, so how do we make that money back? I know, austerity. And now you see the results of austerity. A divided country, a country that's voting for far-right governments, everybody's living standards falling, pretty much we're a laughing stock internationally now. But it's okay because the bankers got off. The financial system carries on, and the politicians are still getting their pockets lined by the financial system. And if you want to blame anyone, blame immigrants or Muslims. And don't say anything against Israel, because otherwise you're a terrible anti-Semite. Marxist super nanny. Marxist super nanny. That's just, I didn't just randomly say that. That's the title of another chapter. That's discipline now is so lax that people basically get away with anything. I think that's what this chapter was, to sum it up. He's a teacher, by the way, or he was a teacher, and one of the things he talks about is how what was this chapter called? It was something to do with Stalinism. I must have missed it. Let me go back to the contents. Reflection. Marxist super nanny. There's not a chapter on it, which is probably why I forgot to speak about it. But under capitalism, everything's become about targets. So, teaching has become about targets, education has become about targets, companies have become about targets and audits and everything else. All of this stuff that produces no real value and actually takes away from the point of something. Similar to what I think David Graeber was writing about in Bullshit Jobs. Bullshit jobs that have no purpose, but they are created so that we can maintain the illusion of high employment, whereas none of those jobs actually really need to be done and would be just as productive. And Graeber talks about how when Keynes predicted in the 40s that with the acceleration of technology we'd have a lot more free time. Some people talked about technological unemployment of about 50%. Well, according to Graeber, we got that 50% of jobs are bullshit jobs, they don't need to be done, so we'd have about 50% unemployment. And then in there he talks about how because of capitalism, most of the jobs that are done, or most of the things that are used to threaten people in jobs, are pointless measures, pointless metrics. So that's part of it. And then the other thing he talks about is mental health, which I think takes one to know one, or takes one to talk about somebody who's experienced with mental health, with the idea of it's kind of like the American dream idea. Because of the insecurity, because of the falling living standards, because of the everything that capitalism in its current incarnation gives us, depression is shooting through the roof. But it's all down to the person, the whole entrepreneurial spirit, to cope with it. It's not a problem of society, it's not created by the political system, it's not created by anything else. It's down to the individual to cope with it. The individualism of capitalism. That's one thing he talks about, which I thought was very interesting. And how capitalism is so pervasive now. If you look at the internet and being constantly connected to the internet, this kind of matrix. He talks about his students who can't take their headphones out even when they're not on because they don't want to be unplugged from the matrix. They have their headphones unplugged, but it's playing. They can't turn it off. They can't feel disconnected, so they can't focus. They can't do anything. That was a fantastically unstructured book review, but I think this book is absolutely brilliant. I think maybe I'm just a bit of a bibliophile, right? Because I always say books are great. I'm sure I've reviewed one or two that I didn't give even 5 out of 10. 9 out of 10. There you go. I thought about that. Let me do what I often do and read you the reviews on the back. Forward by Zoe Fisher, his wife. Introduction by Alex Niven, another lecturer, I think, a writer, a poet. Afterward by Tariq Goddard. I'm not sure who that is, unfortunately. After 1989, capitalism has presented itself as the only realistic political economic system. What effects has this capitalist realism had on work culture, education and mental health? Is it possible to imagine an alternative to capitalism that is not some throwback to discredited models of state control? And Slavoj Žižek, who Slovenian lecturer, very famous guy actually. Let's not beat around the bush. Fisher's compulsively readable book is simply the best diagnosis of our predicament that we have. For examples from daily life and popular culture, but without sacrificing theoretical stringency, he provides a ruthless portrait of our ideological misery. Capitalist realism is a sobering call for patient theoretical and political work. Stephen Shivera, I'm not sure who that is, but he says, Mark Fisher is a master cultural diagnostician, and in capitalist realism he surveys the symptoms of our current cultural malaise. This book offers a brilliant analysis of the pervasive cynicism in which we seem to be mired, and even holds out the prospect of an antidote. Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream writes, the beauty of Mark Fisher's laser-sharp critique of the destructive effects of life under neoliberalism was that it spoke to ordinary people in plain language that went beyond the often hermetic intellectual world of academia. He is greatly missed. We need voices like Mark's more than ever. And then art review. Capitalist realism remains the centerpiece of Fisher's comparatively short but indispensable contribution to British cultural theory. There you go. Done. I hope you enjoyed that.